Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about how to factor quadratics in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is not necessarily equal to 1 as it was in the previous examples. So to do this, we use a method called factoring by grouping. The first step is to find two numbers that sum to b and that multiply to a times c. Previously, it was two numbers that sum to b and multiply to just c, right? As a was 1 before. But now we need to find numbers that work with a times c. Then we're going to separate bx into these two values, right? Because they sum to b. And then we're going to common factor the first two terms and the last two terms separately. So we're going to do two rounds of common factoring. And then we're going to common factor the result. So this might be easier if we do go through an example. So I'm going to go through an example and point out where we're doing each step. So let's start with example A here. And the very first thing I'm going to do is we need to find two numbers that sum to b and multiply to a times c. Okay, so in this case, b is the second number there. It's negative 14, right? The coefficient of x. And then a times c would be 3 times 8. Okay, so 3 times 8 is 24. So I need to find two numbers that multiply to 24 and that add to negative 14. Now, in order for two numbers to add to something negative and multiply to something positive, they both need to be negative numbers, right? Because a negative plus a negative is a negative, and a negative times a negative gives me a positive. So I'm only going to consider negative numbers here because nothing else is going to be possible, right? So I'm going to start with negative 1 times negative 24, negative 2 times negative 12, negative 3 times negative 8, negative 4 times negative 6, and that's all of them. Okay, and another reminder for this as well is it's always best to figure out what multiplies to the a times c value first, because there's only limited things that can do that, whereas there's so many different things that could add to negative 14, right? Whereas here we wrote four potential answers, and then we were able to stop, which was good. Whereas the same would not be able to be said if we started by figuring out what two numbers could add to negative 14, because there's so many. Okay, so what's the answer? Well, let's see. 1 plus negative 1 plus negative 24 is negative 25, so that's not the answer. Negative 2 plus negative 12 is negative 14, so that is the answer. Very good. So negative 2 and negative 14 is what we're going with here. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is step 2. Step 2 says separate bx into these two values. So on the next line, I'm going to write 3x squared minus 2x minus 12x plus 8, right? So essentially what I've done is I've just taken this negative 14x and separated it into these two numbers, into negative 2x minus 12x. If we were to simplify this, we would get the same thing back, right? Because here when we're factoring, we're not trying to change the actual quadratic. We're just trying to change the format of the quadratic in order to make it go from standard form to factored form. All right, next step is common factor the first two terms and the last two terms. So let's start by common factoring these first two terms, which are 3x squared and negative 2x. What is the greatest common factor between them? Well, let's start with greatest common factor between 3 and 2. Well, there is none other than 1, and so we can just skip that part. What about the greatest common factor between x and x squared? Well, that would be x, so I'm going to common factor out the x from here. Then I'm going to do the same thing for these last two terms. So we have negative 12 and positive 8 in this case. So what is the greatest common factor between these two? Well, let's see. 2 would be a common factor. So would 4. 8 would not be, right? 8 doesn't work for 12, so it's going to be 4. So I'm going to go with minus 4. And then we're going to have, let's see, negative 3x minus 2. And if we've done everything correctly up to this point, the number in the brackets, the amount in the brackets should be the same for both, right? We have 3x minus 2 in both sets of brackets here. So then we're going to common factor the result. So we're going to common factor out what's in the brackets because it's presumably going to be the same thing for both. So therefore the answer is 3x minus 2 times x minus 4, like that. And so there we go. There we have it. Now, let's say you're unsure if this is really the right answer or not. Remember, you can always use the FOIL method of expansion to expand this and make sure that you get the question back, right? As long as you get the question back to you, then you're good, right? Then you're good to go. All right, let's move on to a second example here. The second example is 6x squared plus 11x plus 3. So first things first, I need to find two numbers that add to 11 and multiply to 6 times 3, which is 18, right? So what numbers multiply to 18? Well, of course, 6 times 3 does. 3 times 6. What else? 4 doesn't work. 5 doesn't work. But 2 times 9 and also 1 times 18. And these are the only options here. Something I didn't mention before is that because both 11 and 18, both our numbers are positive, I'm only considering positive numbers, right? Because we know that we need two positives to multiply to a positive, and also two positives add to a positive. So we only care about positive answers. Even though two negatives could also multiply to a positive, right? And in fact, they do always multiply to a positive. They would always add to a negative, right? So that's not an option we consider. We only consider positive numbers here. Okay, and then we're going to add everything up. So 3 plus 6 is 9, so that's not right. 2 plus 9 is going to be 11, so that is the right answer. And 1 plus 18 is 19, so that's the wrong answer. So therefore, 2 and 9 are the answers we're going to get. So on my next line, I'm going to separate 11x into 2x plus 9x. So we have 6x squared plus 9x plus 2x plus 3, like that. Then I'm going to common factor the first two terms, and then separately I'll common factor the last two terms. So what's the greatest common factor between 6x squared and 9x? Well, the greatest common factor between 6 and 9 would be 3, right? So I'm going to start with a 3. The greatest common factor between x squared and x would just be x. So therefore 3x is here. And then inside my brackets, I'm getting 2x plus 3. And then for this one here, how do we do this one here? We have greatest common factor between 2x and 3. Well, the thing is, there's no greatest common factor between 2 and 3 other than 1, right? So we can just put 1. And then for x and, no x, same thing. There's no greatest common factor between x and nothing other than just 1. And so therefore, it's just going to be 1, right? 1 times 2x plus 3. So now I'm just going to common factor out the 2x plus 3 from both of these. So I'll get 2x plus 3 times 3x plus 1, like that. And that is in factored form.